Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers, and it is a big one today. We have so much to talk about. We got like 4 or 5 mythics, mythic lands, more of the adversary cycle, a ridiculous mythic dragon, a ton of lore rarity stuff, some good rares, so we should probably jump right into it. Start dogging sweet new magic cards, but before we do, 2 quick reminders. Number 1, if you want to keep up on all the latest spoilers in between these daily spoiler videos, you can find them all over at MTGPreviews.com. And number 2, if you need some cards from today's spoiler video, or really any cards, you can get them from our sponsor, Card Kingdom. They have Innistrad Midnight Hunt up for pre-order now. Head over to cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish, and you can even get a free MTG Goldfish sticker. Just let them know you want one in their order notes, and they will hook you up. So anyway, let's talk Innistrad Midnight Hunt. So first up today, we got the blue member of the mythic adversary cycle, Spectral Adversary, and this card, kind of insane. So 2 mana 2/1 Flash Flying Spirit. When it enters a battlefield, you can pay 1 and a blue any number of times. When you pay that cost, you put that many +1/+1 counters on it, and you get to phase out up to that many target artifacts, creatures, and or enchantments. So Spectral Adversary, it's a relatively on-curve 2 mana flyer that scales incredibly well throughout the game. And remember, this doesn't say phase out things your opponents control. That's one of the huge upsides of Spectral Adversary. In a tempo style deck, you can play this for, let's say, 4 mana, get a 3/2 flash flyer, and phase out one of your opponent's blockers so you can get in more damage. Or maybe your opponent's trying to kill one of your important creatures. You can flash this in and phase out your creature to save it from removal, knowing it's going to come back on your next upkeep anyway. So the flexibility of Spectral Adversary is absolutely huge. I think in Standard, it's basically a replacement for Brazen Borrower. I don't think it's quite as good as Brazen Borrower. The big upside of Brazen Borrower, and really the adventure mechanic, what made it so strong, is how you can split up the cost. You can cast Brazen Borrower as a bounce spell on turn 2, and then on turn 3 or later in the game, cast a creature half. Spectral Adversary on turn 2 is only ever going to be a 2/1 flying flash, which isn't bad. Like, that's still a threat you can put on the battlefield, you can block with it or whatever, ambush an attacker perhaps. But to really get its power, you got to be 4 mana, 6 mana to start kicking it and being able to phase things out. As far as the phase out ability, I think it's actually pretty fairly costed. It's been a long time since phase out was a thing. Like, before the last, couple of sets, we hadn't seen phase out since the earliest days of Magic. But if you look at something like Divine Smite, 2 mana instant, phase out a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls, so you can't even use this on your own stuff. And if it's a black thing, you get to exile it. Like, that's 2 mana. That compares pretty well to Spectral Adversary's kicker. You would expect to pay probably 2 mana just for that phase something out ability. So Spectral Adversary is really competitively costed. Sure, like Sapphire Charm is 1 mana, but only phases out a creature. If you think about how this card scales, it's even better. Like, on turn 2, you get a Rattle Chains, a 2/1 flash flyer, which is fine, especially if you're some sort of tribal deck, aggro deck, tempo deck, just getting the body on the battlefield to start getting in damage. If you get up to 4 mana, it kind of compares to Subtlety, a 3-power flash flyer that's going to temporarily deal with one of your opponent's things. Subtlety does have the upside of making your opponent skip a draw because it puts it on top, or getting rid of it permanently if they put it on the bottom, but still, a 3-power flash flyer for 4 that phases something out is huge. And then if you get up to 6 mana, you basically get a Dream Eater. The same stats, a 4/3 flash flyer. Dream Eater bounces a thing and does some surveilling. Spectral Adversary phases out 2 things, and the biggest difference here is Spectral Adversary works on your own stuff. Subtlety, never going to save your own stuff. Dream Eater can only bounce your opponent's stuff, so you get this additional flexibility. It's already so flexible, and then you get even more flexibility. The Spectral Adversary can be temporarily dealing with your opponent's things. Imagine like phasing out an ensnaring bridge so you can swing in for a lethal attack, or getting rid of a Emrakul that's about to kill you, or a Comb, or some other big attacker. Like, that's huge, but at the same time, it can be saving your own stuff restoration style from removal, which is also kind of insane. Like, at 4 mana, you're getting a 3/4 Restoration Angel, essentially. That is amazing. And then in Standard, I think this has a ready-built home. Like, I think if you were playing Brazen Borrower in, like, the Is It Dragon deck, I don't know why you wouldn't just slot this in to save your dragons, clear the way for more attacks, and then it's also a spirit. That's the final upside, and we've seen a bit of spirit support in Standard. We just got Patrician Geist. I don't know if we have quite enough to make a super competitive top-tier spirit tribal deck in Standard yet, but as we continue to get more spirits in Innistrad, presumably in Kamigawa, I wouldn't be surprised if we did have spirit tribal. And in older formats, I think that's the home for Spectral Adversary. I don't know if this is quite good enough in a format like Modern to just show up in a generic deck. There's so many options in a format like Modern, but in Spirit Tribal, it works with Ether Vial, it works with Coco. If you have enough mana, you can Coco or Violet into play and still play at pseudo kicker cost. And then we have like Historic Spirits that are playing Brazen Bar, where I think if you're playing Spirit Lords, Spectral Adversary, there's a pretty good argument that this is just a better tempo play than Brazen Bar, where in Modern, it's a little bit more convoluted because you have so many spirits. It's really fighting with Shacklegeist, I think would be the slot it's in. Shacklegeist, the upside is it's very repeatable. Tap 2 spirits to tap down one of your opponent's things. That's kind of like phasing a thing out, and you can just do that again and again. Of course, it does require tapping down your own creature, so you're going to lose some of that attacking power or blocking power. Spectral Adversary, though, does have the upside of saving like a Spell Queller, which seems huge. You're a Drog Skull Captain. Imagine flashing in Spell Queller, eating one of your opponent's spells, and then your opponent goes to kill your Spell Queller to get their thing back, and you flash in Spectral Adversary to phase out the Spell Queller, keeping the spell locked underneath it, and then getting the Spell Queller back again on your upkeep anyway. That seems like a huge, huge swing. So Spectral Adversary, I think this is just a generically good card in Standard. I don't think you got to be Spirit Tribal. I think this is our maybe not quite as good, but still very strong Brazen Borrower replacement. And then in older formats, in Spirit Tribal, I can certainly see at least an argument for playing this card as a solid tempo play that can get blockers or attackers out of the way, get rid of those ensnaring bridges that might be locking you down, offering that flexibility, and potentially saving your own key creatures from removal. So just all around, another really good adversary. I think this one would definitely rank ahead of the Black Adversary, and it might rank ahead of the White Adversary. The White Adversary is really good, but what I like about Spectral Adversary is it's more flexible. The White Adversary, you basically got to be a go-wide creature deck. If you're not a go-wide creature deck, it's not going to offer that much value. Spectral Adversary, in its ability, it can work in a relatively creature-light deck or in a creature-heavy tempo style deck, so that might mean that it's even better than the white one, and the white one is super insane. We also got a ridiculous new dragon, Moonveil Regent, 4 mana 4/4 dragon with flying. Whenever you cast a spell, you can discard your hand. If you do, you draw cards for each of that spell's colors, and then when it dies, it deals X damage to any target, where X is the number of colors among permanents you control. So when you first read Moonveil Regent, you think, okay, this is a 5-color card. I cast my Tiamat and I draw 5 cards, or Ur-Dragon, or Scion of the Ur-Dragon. And while I do think that Moonveil Regent is basically an auto-include in 5-color dragon-style commander decks, I think it actually does way more than that. I think that's selling it short. Although obviously, like, being able to cast a Tiamat and draw 5 cards and tutor up 5 dragons is kind of absurd. Like, the amount of card advantage this can generate is absolutely bonkers. So I do think it works well in 5-color decks. It obviously does. Unfortunately, as a monocolored card, I'm not sure it works in the 5-color Niv decks in like Pioneer and Modern, Historic even. Really, Niv wants all of its cards to be 2 colors so we can find them. Maybe Moonveil's so good and offers so much card advantage that you can play it with Niv anyway, but I'm a little bit skeptical there. The thing is, I don't think you got to be a 5-color deck to play this card. This card has so much power and can do so many different things. Even if you're not drawing 5 cards from Tiamat, it's still absurd. Like, picture some sort of Storm deck, and I'm not saying that tier Modern Storm is going to play this, but just picture the things this deck can do in that style of deck. Like, you cast a Manamorphose. That's a 2-color card. It's essentially free because you get the mana back. It also draws you a card. With a Moonveil Regent out, Manamorphose turns into a free Ancestor Recall. It's a free draw 3. Sure, you got to discard your hand, but that's fine. If you're playing a Storm style deck and you're casting Pyretic Rituals and drawing a card, in Desperate Rituals and drawing a card and making a ton of mana, you don't mind discarding your hand because your big payoff is Past in Flames, Underworld Breach, stuff that wants your graveyard full of spells anyway. So in some sense, discarding your hand is an upside, plus this is just letting you churn through your entire deck at lightning speed to support the combo kill. In Standard, I could see this showing up and just like, is it combat dragons, like even if you're drawing 2 cards off Galazeth or a card off Goldspan Dragon, that's fine. And this is also a good blocker against these popular dragon threats. Like, it stonewalls Galazeth, it trades with Goldspan Dragon, thanks to the damage that it deals when it dies. Even if you only have 1 color of permanent on the battlefield, it's actually going to trade up with Imarith. You deal 4 to it and then you ping it for the last one. So it's actually a very effective body on defense against some of the best flying threats in the format. I can imagine this showing up in the Foretell Dragon decks. One of the upsides in those decks is Foretell is a way that you can keep cards in your hand, sort of, but not have them in your hand. You can foretell all your Elrond's Epiphanies, Saw It Comings, Behold the Multiverse, still have access to those at all times, and be free to discard your hand as you cast Expressive Iteration to draw a ton of cards, or Prismari Command to draw a ton of cards. That's fine, because your most important cards are locked away in exile anyway, and you can still cast them from there. Also think that this is good enough just to play in like mono red. I think that's the sneaky part of this card. We started off talking about 5 color decks, then we went to like 2 color decks in Storm combos, now we're to mono red, and I think this is just a fine finisher in mono red. Like in mono red, you play this and you're probably not going to have any cards in hand, and then you cast your Kargan Intimidator that you top deck and you get to draw a card. Even if you don't have any cards in hand, you can still technically discard your hand. So if you're empty-handed in Hellbent, anything you cast is just going to be draw 1 card, and you can potentially just chain stuff together. Plus, standard mono red is playing things like Dragonkin Berserker cares about dragons, Magda cares about dragons, so you get a little extra value there as well. Could even work in some sort of like Memekin or mono red storm deck in Historic with Burgi and Runaway Steamkin, where you can make a ridiculous amount of mana by casting spells, with Moonveil Regent providing the cards to keep the chain going and drawing cards and making more mana until you eventually win with a Grape Shot or an Electrostatic Field. So I love this card. Moonveil Regent, it is really powerful. I know it looks like a 5 color card, and it is a 5 color card. It's going to be great there, but I think this has potential all the way down to like mono red decks that are aggressive and going to be empty-handed. The card advantage is huge. The damage is a nice bonus. It's got a big body that can potentially trade up in combat thanks to its Death Trigger. There is really not much to dislike about Moonveil Regent. The card is just spectacular. Next on our list, we have Grafted Identity, a 4-mana creature stealing enchantment. So 4 mana, it's an aura, is an additional cost to cast it. Sack a creature. Enchant a creature. You control enchanted creature. That creature gets +1/+1. So this is the closest thing we've had to control magic in a while. Back in the early days of Magic, we just had 4 mana steal a creature. Then that even maybe upgraded with treachery and kind of the mid-years of Magic. More recently, we have like 5 mana versions of it, and we haven't even gotten just straightforward 5 mana versions. Very recently, Wizards has kind of shied away from printing this effect, but Grafted Identity, I think this is really strong. Sure, it's not a straight up 2-for-1. You don't just cast it and steal your opponent's creature. You do have to sack one of your creatures, which I think is designed to make it fair. However, we're entering a standard that is all about these decaying creatures. Poppet Stitcher tokens, Jadar tokens, Tainted Adversary. And one of the things we've been talking about throughout spoiler season is how the decay creatures are really difficult to use as normal creatures. They can't block, they can only attack once, they're at their base only 2/2, so they might not even be able to attack at all. So one of the easiest ways to take advantage of these decay creatures is have synergies where you can sacrifice them for value, and Grafted Identity seems huge there. Like, it's so cheap to make decay creatures in a deck that's making a bunch of decay zombies. Grafted Identity is pretty close to control magic. Like, sure, you gotta sack a decay creature, but that creature's so bad and semi-useless that you really don't care, and then you even give +1/+1 to the creature you steal, which is a huge upside. And we got other stuff that likes to be sacrificed. We've seen decks sacrificing Eye Twitch to get lessons, or Shambling Gas to make treasures or be removal, so there's plenty of easy sacrifice things. So even though it isn't a direct control magic, just steal your thing 2-for-1, if you're build around this a little bit and you have an Eye Twitch to sacrifice or a decay token, then it is very, very close to an actual control magic. Plus, it gets rid of anything. It gets rid of Coma's. Coma's an annoying threat to deal with. It's staying in standard, really hard to kill, but with Grafted Grafted Identity, you're not killing it. You're just yoinking it and putting it into play under your control, so it doesn't matter if it's indestructible, doesn't matter how many coils it's making. The only downside is, as an enchantment, it is killable, and if your opponent kills it, they're going to get their creature back, and we do have enchantment removal. We got Feed the Swarm, black enchantment removal. We got Rip Apart, which could definitely be main deckable. Binding of the Old Gods feels like a staple level removal spell, so we'll have to wait and see. I think how good Grafted Identity ends up being is mostly going to depend on what else is in Standard and what's seeing play. If everyone's playing main deck answers to Grafted Identity, it gets a lot worse, but if we're not running into too many Feed the Swarms and Binding the Old Gods and bounce spells and so forth, then Grafted Identity could be a legitimate card to play in Standard, so I like it. I think this is the best control magic that we've seen in quite a while, especially within the context of Innistrad Midnight Hunt, where we have all these useless-ish decay creatures that we can sacrifice. We also got, oh good lord, Wipe Out the Horde, the new best wrath in the Commander format. 8 mana sorcery, costs 1 less to cast. For each creature on the battlefield, destroy all creatures. This is the White Blasphemous Act, essentially. I guess it's never literally 1 mana like Blasphemous Act, but this is a wrath that's often going to be 2 mana, and unlike Blasphemous Act, which deals damage to creatures and can theoretically leave creatures on the battlefield in some scenarios, Wipe Out the Horde is going to get rid of everything. It just straight up blows up anything. You don't got to worry about a 14 toughness creature sticking around. This card is going to be the best wrath in the Commander format. It reminds me a little bit of Hour of Revelation, which can be 3 mana if there's enough non-land permanents on the battlefield. The thing is, I actually don't play Hour of Revelation that much in Commander because it hits all non-land permanents. And one thing I've noticed is, while some decks are fine with that, there are some decks where you want a Wrath, but you really want to keep your artifacts, enchantments, planeswalkers, whatever around, which makes blowing up all non-land permanents kind of a bit of a downside. Wipe Out the Horde is going to work similarly, where if there's a bunch of creatures on the battlefield, it's going to be super cheap, so you can Wrath the board, immediately deploy some threats to rebuild your battlefield, or cheap enough that you can make your board indestructible and then cast this and kind of combo that way. So I feel like this is what Hour of Revelation wanted to be. If you're playing Wrath of God or Day of Judgment or Fumigate, that's fine. They're still good cards, and you want more than 1 Wrath in your Commander deck usually, but I think this immediately shoots to the top of the list. If you were going to play 1 creature-only Wrath in your Commander deck, I think Wipe Out the Horde is the one. The upside of being 2 mana is just too good to pass up. On the other hand, there's definitely still a role for wraths that can hit non-creatures. Austere Command, Cleansing Nova. The upside of being able to hit artifacts and enchantments when you want to is actually a really big deal. So I don't think this just invalidates every wrath in the format. But like I said, for creature-only wraths, this is as good as it gets. In Standard, little less excited. In Standard, I think Doomscar is probably still better. Not that Wipe Out the Horde is bad, and there's certainly matchups where your opponent's going to be going super wide, and having a potential 2-mana Wrath is huge, but if you think about the decks that normally play Wrath, control style decks, they're often not adding that many permanents to the battlefield or that many creatures to the battlefield themselves, and if your opponent's playing smart, they're not just going to dump 10 creatures on the battlefield or, 5 creatures on the battlefield, because they're going to be wary of overextending into a Wrath. So I think in Standard, I would rather have the consistency of Doomscar, which can also be 3 mana if you foretell it, rather than the potential upside of heavy and even cheaper Wrath, but having times when your opponent is wise to the Wipe Out the Horde potentially coming, they only play a couple of creatures, they focus on making those big, and you have this Wipe Out the Horde at 6 mana stuck in your hand as you get beaten down. I don't think it's completely unplayable in Standard, but I would say it's probably a bit worse than Doomscar. But Wipe Out the Horde, it's a White Blasphemous Act. I expect this to shoot up the rankings of most played white cards in Commander. I think it's better than Wrath of God, better than Day of Judgment, better than any other creature-only Wrath in the format. So if you're playing Wraths in your white deck in Commander, get some Wipe Out the Hordes, because this card is bonkers. We also got Old Stickfingers, a Golgari legendary horror. So green, black, and X. You get a star. When you cast it, you reveal cards from the top of your library to reveal X creature cards. Put all the creature cards revealed that way into your graveyard, the rest in the bottom of your library in any order, and its power and toughness is equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So essentially, this is a way to fill your graveyard with creatures, and that, of course, also grows your Old Stickfingers. My concern with this card is the star power and toughness. We've seen similar cards in the past. Maybe the best comparison is Old Sticky Fingers is the rare version of Boneyard Worm. Boneyard Worm, 2 mana, power and toughness equal to the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Same exact text. The upside of Old Stick Fingers is it's going to take and put some creatures in your graveyard if you cast it for 3 mana, 4 mana, 5 mana, and grow itself. Same with like Splinter Fright has a similar formatting. The problem with these cards is if your opponent wraths your graveyard, they kill your creature as well. The upside is huge. If nothing goes wrong, you grow these massive creatures and you fill your graveyard and you take over the game. But if your opponent plays a Leyline of the Void or Rest in Peace or Soul Guide Lander or anything that hates on your graveyard, all of a sudden things go really poorly, because not only do you lose all of your graveyard fuel that you've been setting up, you're going to lose your Old Stick Fingers too. It's going to be a 0/0 when your graveyard gets wrath. So that's the risk, and that makes me a little skeptical about this being standard playable. On the other hand, there are some shenanigans with this. Like, because of how it's worded, you can potentially manipulate what you hit with your Old Stick Fingers by playing not many creatures in your deck. Like, let's say your deck is 4 Old Stick Fingers and 4 Grizzlebrads. If you cast Old Stick Fingers for 3 mana and put 1 creature into your graveyard, odds are it's going to be Grizzlebrad. If you can cast it for 4 or 5 mana and hit multiple creatures, you're almost certainly going to get the Grizzlebrad, then you just reanimate it. So with some deck building shenanigans, you can kind of turn this into like an Entomb almost, or a Buried Alive. Of course, there is a deck building cost to doing this, but it's still worth considering. Maybe there's some sort of combo where you can manipulate exactly what you're getting with Old Stick Fingers to make sure that you're getting the reanimation target of choice. Only thing is, remember, you're probably playing 4 Old Stick Fingers, and if you're playing 4 Old Stick Fingers and you cast this for 3, there's also a chance you just Stick Fingers into a Stick Fingers in your graveyard, which is probably not what you're going for. The other way to play this is just try to go big. Play Old Stick Fingers, play your Cabal Coffers in Urborg and Crick Pavag Gadeems, with the plan being that you just put a ton of creatures in your graveyard, and then Living End or Living Death or Patriarch's Bidding, whatever, some mass reanimation spell to just get them all back. And then you don't really care what you're hitting with Old Stick Fingers, because getting back any huge amount of creatures is going to be good. Like, picture Cabal Coffers making enough mana that you can Old Stick Fingers like X10, make like 15 mana, Old Stick Fingers X10, and then follow that up with your mass reanimation spell in the same turn. That's probably going to win you the game. Also, if you want to go ultra janky, Old Stick Fingers X20 plus Mortal Kombat plus Living to your upkeep is a way that you can win the game on the spot. There are some other ways to do this with spirits that can put a lot of things in the graveyard, but I think that if you want to take the against the odds challenge for Mortal Kombat, Old Stick Fingers is probably one of the best ways to do it. Like, get up to 22 mana, and Old Stick Fingers by itself going to guarantee, as long as you got 20 creatures in your deck, that you're going to get the 20 creatures in the graveyard you need to win on your upkeep with Mortal Kombat. In Standard, I could see there being a deck built around this. I know I'm a little skeptical of the star mana cost and of graveyard hate, but we got a lot of sweet pieces. Imagine playing a deck maybe with Ghoulcaller's Harvest that we were talking about yesterday, how it needs ways to fill the graveyard to really work, but maybe the only creatures in your deck are like Even Death, Skyclave Shade, Narfi. If they're all things that can return from the graveyard, that's actually like kind of frightening. Imagine playing a deck where your only creatures are 4 Skyclave Shades, and you cast your Old Stick Fingers for like 6 mana, 7 mana, 8 mana, put all your Skyclave Shades in the graveyard, and then that's just your plan for winning the game. You're just getting them back repeatedly and beating your opponent down with spells like Ghoulcaller's Harvest maybe as a backup. So I think there are ways to build around this. In Commander, I think this is more of a 99 card. Maybe in those combo style decks that we were talking about, if you're trying to win with Mortal Kombat, or you're trying to set up a big Living End win or something, then I could see Old Stick Fingers being a good commander. But in a more generic graveyard deck, I think I'd rather have like Madroltha, Marin, Azoni, and then have Old Stick Fingers in my 99 as a way to fill my graveyard. Because I think, especially if you can make a lot of mana, which commander decks are good at, this is a really good way to just get a massive creatures in your graveyard, and then you could use your Marin or Madroltha or whatever to get them back, or make a ton of tokens with your Izoni. So Old Stick Fingers, a little bit concerned about graveyard hate in the star power and toughness. That might be a reason that it doesn't see much play in Standard, but it is a neat and powerful card, and if you build around it a bit, it can do some really sweet things. Next on our list, we got a new white human knight legend, Adeline Resplendent Cathar. So it's 3 mana, star 4. It's a human knight legend. It has vigilance. Its power is equal to the number of creatures you control. And whenever you attack, for each opponent, create a 1/1 white human creature token that's tapped and attacking that player or a planeswalker they control. So essentially, Adeline, at first glance, is a Ironroot Warlord. And when I first saw this card, I was like, all right, it's going to be bad. It's Ironroot Warlord with, I guess, the upside that when you attack, you get to make a token, or if you're playing Commander, maybe 3 tokens, 1 for each opponent. Those tokens, though, are 1/1s and probably going to get eaten by something in combat, but they do grow Adeline, which is kind of nice. But Ironroot Warlord, really similar, and that never really did anything when it was in Standard. However, it is 2 colors. Adeline's only 1 color, and the more I thought about Adeline, I started to think, wait, maybe this card is actually kind of good. What if it's actually Brimaz or a Goblin Rabblemaster? We've seen other similar threats that make a token when they attack, and that token's, you know, attacking the opponent, or Goblin Rabblemaster making a token each combat. We have seen cards like this be really good. Is Adeline a Brimaz, or is it a Ironroot Warlord? The more I think about it, the more I'm leaning towards this card actually being a solid mid-range threat. Like, with, what, 2 other creatures on the battlefield, you're getting Brimaz stats, and it doesn't give you the defense of Brimaz, making a cat token when it blocks, but it does have the upside of growing throughout the game. If you can make more creatures, you're going to get more power than Brimaz, and we've seen both Brimaz and Goblin Rabblemaster be very solid threats all the way back to formats like Modern, so maybe Adeline is a lot better than I thought at first glance. It's also a human, and it makes humans, and while we haven't seen a ton of human payoffs yet, we do have Sigarda, which I don't know how good Sigarda is actually going to be, but we don't have a ton yet. There could be more human payoffs coming. Like, that is one of the themes of Innistrad. We got this Innistrad set and a whole nother Innistrad set in a couple of months, so maybe we actually end up with a human tribal deck. In that deck, Adeline goes up even more in value because of the tokens that it's making. They're going to be humans, which would trigger your Champion of the Parish or benefit from a human lord. So we'll have to see what human pieces we get, but with Adeline, Indomitable Adversary, Luminarch Aspirant, Sigarda, we already got pieces to head in the direction of some sort of human tribal deck in Standard. In older formats, I'm guessing it's not going to be good enough. At least in Modern, I think it's just too slow for Modern humans. Like, the shenanigans we were talking about, making a human token to trigger your Champion of the Parish and Thalia's Lieutenant, those are sweet, but I think it's probably going to be a little too slow. On the other hand, in like historic humans or even pioneer humans, we've seen some black-white human decks built around General Kudrow, Thalia's Lieutenant, just entering the historic format. In those decks, Adeline could be in the consideration, probably like a 1 of or maybe a 2 of because it's legendary, but it's on tribe, it makes tribe members, and if you can go wide enough, it can have a lot of power, and vigilance is an upside. You can attack with it and still have it back on defense. The other thing I like about Adeline is I feel like this is one of the better human token, or maybe just tokens in a vacuum commanders in mono white. One of the awkward things about white token commanders is they don't have a super good leader. Some people play like Elishnorn because it pumps your tokens, Heliod makes token, Prava kind of makes tokens and cares about tokens. Adeline, I feel like, might be the go-to for mono white tokens, especially if you want to have a human sub-theme. If you have a human sub-theme for your tokens, then this is clearly the way to go. And even if you don't, this might just be the new go-to token commander for mono white decks, so I like this card. When I first saw it, I was skeptical, but the more I think about this card, the more I read about this card, what it does, its creature types, the more I've come around on it potentially being a pretty good threat in Standard, being a good commander for mono white human tokens decks, and maybe even having a small chance in some non-standard formats. We also got Siphon Insight, a 2-mana Dimir instant. Look at the top 2 cards of target opponent's library, exile one of them face down, put the other one on the bottom of that library. You may look at and play the exiled card for as long as it remains exiled, and you can spend mana as though it was mana of any color to cast this spell, and you can flash it back for 3 mana. So Siphon Insight, it's kind of like a reverse curate, where you get to steal one of the top 2 cards of your opponent's deck at instant speed, and then cast that card. However, I don't think Siphon Insight is actually a very good card. Like, it's a super fun card, and I would certainly play in like Theft-style commander decks if you're playing Send Triplets or Admiral Beckett Brass or Dragon Lord Sumgar, where your theme is stealing and winning with your opponent's cards. However, as far as seeing actual competitive play, I think you want cantrips that target your own deck, because when you think about it, you build your deck theoretically with cards that synergize and work together, I would rather play an actual Curate, honestly, and Curate doesn't really see any play, that gives me one of the top 2 cards of my deck than one of the top 2 cards of my opponent's deck, because my opponent's deck probably not going to be that helpful. You're playing a control deck against mono red, and you're going to get, what, a red 1-drop? Like, that's not something you're really interested in. Or you're playing an aggro deck like Rogues, and you're playing against a control deck. What are you going to take? A random removal spell that you don't have any targets for? So I feel like this is a card that's designed to be fun, and I like the flavor of it. It's a cool card. I can't wait to cast it because stealing your opponent's stuff is sweet. But as far as being good and showing up in tournament-style decks, I don't really have high hopes for Siphon Insight. We also got Dire Strain Rampage, a interesting new Gruul sorcery. So 3 mana sorcery has a flashback of 5 mana, says destroy target artifact, enchantment, or land. If a land was destroyed this way, its controller may search their library for up to 2 basic lands, put them into play tapped, and shuffle. Otherwise, its controller may search their library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, and shuffle. So Dire Strain Rampage, when you first read this card, it reads like a removal spell. It reads like, okay, I'm going to use this to kill my opponent's thing, and then they're going to get lands. Unfortunately, that's not very good. Blowing up an artifact for 3 mana and giving your opponent a land for the trouble, or a land for 3 mana and giving your opponent 2 lands for the trouble, that is not ideal. But that's not what this card is about. What this card is essentially like a sorcery speed hero. You play this because you're going to target your own stuff with it. Your plan is going to be, I blow up one of my lands, I get 2 lands, it turns it into a ram spell, making it very similar to Harrow, and you get flashback out of the deal. And then you have this bad Assassin's Trophy mode. It's kind of a failsafe. If things are going wrong and your opponent has a artifact, a Embercleave that's going to kill you, or whatever the big artifact ends up being after rotation, or in Commander it's even more relevant, where everyone has artifacts and enchantments running around, but there's some really important artifact or enchantment or land, a Field of the Dead, that's going to take over the game, then you bite the bullet, you cast it on your opponent's thing, you know it's not efficient, you don't feel good about giving them a land, but you gotta do what you gotta do. So that's how you play this card. You play this because you're playing maybe a landfall deck in Standard alongside Roiling Regrowth, and you got your Lotus Cobras and Scute Swarms and Phalis and Morogs or whatever, and then you cast this, you're getting 2 lands, you're getting a ton of landfall triggers, you can even flash it back again later in the game. That's very strong. Like, that is very synergistic and powerful in a landfall style deck. And then you get that fringe upside of maybe hitting your opponent's stuff. I did want to point out, when you first read the card, you think, ooh, this can be another Cleansing Wildfire with like Cascading Cataracts. We've seen decks all the way back to Modern that are using Cleansing Wildfire to blow up their own indestructible land just to ramp and draw a card, but it doesn't actually work if you read the cards carefully. Cleansing Wildfire says destroy a land, period. Its controller may do this. Dire Strain Rampage says, destroy a land if a land was destroyed this way, and since the indestructible land wouldn't actually end up being destroyed, if you target your own Cascading Cataracts with Dire Strain Rampage, you're not going to get anything from it. It's not going to work, so please, please, please do not try to do that. However, it does work with Flagstones of Trokir, because you're actually destroying it, and then Flagstones will get you land, and then Dire Strain Rampage will get you 2 lands, so there could be some sort of Naya landfall shenanigans that could take advantage of it, but it doesn't combo with indestructible lands. In Commander, I think it's more of the same. I think you have to be playing a deck that wants to use this on your own stuff to play Dire Strain Rampage. Don't play it just as a removal spell. In a generic deck, there's better options. Giving your opponent's lands bad, but if you're playing a deck that cares about landfall, Uban, or Omnath, or Phalith, or some land synergy deck like Lord Windgrace, then you play this in your deck to use on your own stuff to support your synergies, and sometimes you blow up a key artifact or enchantment from your opponents when the situation arises. So I really like Dire Strain Rampage. When you think of it as a ramp spell, with the upside that like 10% of the time maybe you target your opponent's thing, it's actually a really good card. When you think of it as a removal spell, and like 10% of the time you're going to target your own stuff, it is stone unplayable. So keep that in mind as you're building around it. Really powerful, but most of the time you want to be hitting your own stuff and using this as a ramp spell. We also got Briarbridge Tracker, a new green 3-drop, a 3-mana human scout. You get a 2/3 with vigilance. When it enters the battlefield, you make a clue token, and as long as you control a token, it gets +2/+0. So essentially, it comes into play and makes a clue. It'll be a 4/3 thanks to the clue, or if you have other tokens, you can sack the clue. This is a really interesting card to me. This is a card that makes me doubly thankful Lovestruck Beast is leaving the format. If Lovestruck Beast was still around, this card would be stone unplayable. A 4/3 just doesn't get through a Lovestruck Beast. We dealt with this for the last 2 years in Standard, with so many sweet cards like Briarbridge Tracker just being completely unplayable because they can't line up well enough with something like Lovestruck Beast. But Lovestruck Beast is gone. It is a new day in Standard. Anything is possible, and that includes Briarbridge Tracker being playable. This is kind of a 3-mana Thraben Inspector, and Thraben Inspector is a sneaky powerful card. Who would have thought that Thraben Inspector would end up being one of the most played, most impactful cards from our last return to Innistrad? Just making a clue token is really good. In Briarbridge Tracker, sure, it's 3 mana rather than 1 mana, that's a different spot on the curve, but still a 3 mana 4/3 that makes a clue and has vigilance. That's actually like not a bad threat in the format we're heading into. We'll see how it works out. It's got to compete with things like Kazandu Mammoth. It's got to compete with things like Old Growth Troll, but having an on-curve 3-drop that leaves behind a clue, so if your opponent rasts your board or something, you can draw a card and try to rebuild, that's actually a pretty reasonable option. So I think there's a chance that this is Standard playable, and it could get even better if we end up getting synergies for investigating. We don't really have many or any in Standard now, but if we end up getting some things that care about clue tokens, care about investigation, even care about extra card draw, then Briarbridge Tracker goes up even more in value. But with Lovestruck Beast being gone, praise the magic gods, I think this card could actually be good in Standard. We also got the red member of the Adversary cycle, Bloodthirsty Adversary. So 2 mana 2/2 hasty vampire. When it enters the battlefield, you can pay 2 and a red any number of times. For each time you pay, you put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then exile up to that many target instants or sorceries with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard. Copy them. You can cast any number of the copies without paying their mana cost. So Bloodthirsty Adversary, good news is 2/2 haste, pretty good constructed cards. We've seen Robber of the Riches, Ash Zealots, Zertar Goblins be constructed playable, Standard staples even. So 2/2 haste with upside. We're starting with a good baseline for Bloodthirsty Adversary. And then if you manage to kick, and I guess I'm going to call it kick, even though it's not technically kicking, but you know what I mean. If you manage to pay the additional ETB cost on Bloodthirsty Adversary, you're essentially getting a Goblin Dark Dweller. Like, you're going to get a 3/3 haste that allows you to flashback essentially 1 mana value 3 or less instant or sorcery from your graveyard. Can also make the argument that if this hits exactly something with mana value of 3, you essentially get a Snapcaster Mage. Snapcaster Mage, 2 to cast. If you flashback something that costs 3, that would be 5 total mana, same as Bloodthirsty Adversary. So sort of a sorcery speed Snapcaster Mage, assuming the thing you hit is mana value of 3 that comes in with haste and an extra +1/+1 counter. I think that's actually a pretty good card. Like, on turn 2, especially on the play, just run this out as an aggro threat, and then off the top later in the game, you're going to be able to flash back a spell with it. In Standard, this is probably a removal spell, maybe getting a Poison to the Cup, maybe a Prismari command, card draw like Plumb the Forbidden, Roiling Regrowth for ramp. There's plenty of options as far as cheap instants and sorceries to flash back. So I think this card's actually pretty powerful. We've seen Goblin Dark Dweller actually be played a bit all the way back to Modern. In Modern and in older formats, my favorite thing to do with cards like this is flashback land destruction. Stone Rains, Molten Rains, Pillages, hopefully ramp on turn 1, turn 2, blow up a land, turn 3, blow up a land, turn 4, Bloodthirsty Adversary, flashback a Stone Rain effect, blow up another land. Now that we have this alongside Goblin Dark Dwellers, and I guess you could run Snapcaster as well, we have a lot of ways to flashback land destruction spells from the graveyard, which could make for a new deck or an improvement of an old deck in Modern. Also, this is another way that you can cast no mana spell cards. Ancestral Vision, Crashing Footfall, Living End, because you're casting them, the copies, without paying their mana cost. That gets around the no mana cost aspect of Crashing Footfalls or whatever, so maybe this could show up in a deck like that, although really, it's so similar to Goblin Dark Dweller. If we haven't seen Goblin Dark Dweller doing a shenanigan, then this probably isn't either, although there is some upsides here. The flexibility, that's the big thing with this adversary cycle. Goblin Dark Dweller is 5 mana. Bloodthirsty Adversary, it's only 2 mana, which means you can play this in a Lurrus deck. You can cast this, kick it in the late game, get back a Faithless Looting or a Kolaghan's Command. Those decks already are putting things into the graveyard with Dreadhorde Arcanist or reanimating creatures sometimes, and you can still pay for the ETB cost, even if it's reanimated, cast it from the graveyard again later with Lurrus. So there's certainly shenanigans for Bloodthirsty Adversary, and this could just be a good burn card. I don't think it's good enough for Modern Burn, probably a bit too slow. Modern Burn isn't trying to get to 5 mana. They have so many sack lands, the Horizon lands, to turn extra lands into cards that you almost never get to 5 mana in Modern Burn. But in like Historic Burn, maybe a Pioneer Burn deck, this could be reasonable. In those formats, a 2/2 haste for 2 is okay, and then the upside in the late game that you cast this, you kick it, you get a 3/3 haste and flashback a Skewer the Critics or Wizard's Lightning or whatever. That's a pretty nice upside. So Bloodthirsty Adversary, the card's good. I don't know if this is the most exciting of the adversaries, although I will say it starts at one of the best baselines. 2/2 haste, that's a fine thing in a red aggro style deck anyway. So I think that you're starting with such a good baseline, even though that the kicker cost is a little expensive and you don't even get 1 use until you get to 5 mana, and getting up to like 8 mana for 2 uses or 11 mana for 3 is probably not very practical compared to some of the other adversaries that have a lesser kicker cost. This card is still very solid. I think this is the Robber of the Rich replacement in Standard. It's got the vampire creature type and some of those shenanigans we were talking about. Flashing back no mana cost spells, flashing back land destruction, Goblin Dark Dweller style. Give us some potential in older formats too. We also got a mythic land, and this card is a little weird to me. Hostel Hotel / Creeping In, and I love the flavor of this card. It's a creepy hotel that literally becomes a creepy hotel, but the front side of this card, it's a land, it adds colorless, you can pay 1, tap it, sack a creature, put a soul counter on Hostile Hotel, and then if there are 3 or more counters on it, transform it and untap it, and you can only activate this as a sorcery. And then the backside, Creeping In, is a black 3/7 that when it attacks, you can exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of creature card exiled with Creeping In, and you can pay 4 to phase it out. So expensive removal protection, but removal protection nonetheless. So essentially a land that can sack creatures, and once you sack 3 or more creatures, you're going to flip around into a somewhat powerful creature, a 3/7 that can slowly drain away your opponent. The first attack you drain for 1, the next one drain for 2, etc, etc, etc. So we've seen lands that can sack creatures be powerful in the past. Phyrexian Tower, currently good in Historic, shows up in Commander. High Market, just sack a creature, you gain a life, shows up in Commander decks. The problem I have with Hostile Hotel is twofold. One is, it's a lot of mana to sack a creature. Like Phyrexian Tower, you just tap it. High Market, you just tap it. Hostile Hotel, you gotta pay 1 and tap it. So essentially you're using 2 mana because you're losing your Hostile Hotel mana as well. So it's essentially 2 mana to sack a creature. I don't think that's a deal breaker, but it's worth keeping in mind. The bigger issue with Hostile Hotel is that last line of text, activate only as a sorcery. Part of the power of lands like High Market is it gives you a way to sacrifice a creature that is about to die anyway. Your opponent goes to kill your creature, you sacrifice it. Or better yet, it's a way you can get around exile-based removal. If your opponent goes to exile a creature that you care about, especially in Commander, you can sacrifice it instead, get it in the graveyard, get it back later with an Eternal Witness or something. So being sorcery speed only really limits Hostile Hotel's potential. I don't think that means it's unplayable, because we do have shenanigans for it in Standard. So I think rather than just being a card that you can throw in any deck, the only as a sorcery part means you gotta build around it a bit, but we can build around it in Standard. Like, the payoff is pretty good. Creeping In is a powerful creature, and we have things like Eye Twitch. We have Jadar, for example, which every turn is going to make a Decay Zombie. We sack the Decay Zombie. We can then get another one on our end step that's quickly going to flip our Hostel Hotel. We got Tainted Adversary. So this is another way, I think, in Standard to take advantage of Decay Zombies and other death creatures like Eye Twitch in that style of deck. Even though Hostel Hotel is not as good as I would like. You can't do the, sack in response to removal to fizzle your opponent's stuff shenanigans. I still think in that deck, it's a relatively reasonable payoff. It only takes 3 activations to flip it around, and once you flip it around, it's not a bad creature. Like, it reminds me a little bit of a Awaken the Blood avatar. Awaken the Blood avatar, the token it makes is a 3/6 that when it attacks, it hits your opponent for 3 direct damage. Creeping in, you get a 3/7. Its first attack only hitting for 1, but it's drain rather than damage, so you're actually gaining back some life, which makes it a little bit better. Second attack, 2, then 3, then 4, so it kind of spirals with that direct damage drain mode, and it gets a little bit of protection, so I think the creature that you're turning into, it is a worthy payoff. It's not immediately game ending, but it is a legitimate creature. So I think there is a home for this in Standard, in a sack deck, in a Decay Zombie deck, but I don't think it's good enough to just be a generic card that you can throw in any deck. If you could sacrifice creatures in response to removal, then this would be in the conversation, I think, for many decks. I think you just toss it in, and if you don't got anything else going on, leave it up. If your opponent tries to kill your thing, well, get a counter on Hostel Hotel, and eventually you're going to get the creeping in out of it. As it is, I think it's more of a build around. The other thing I wanted to mention about this card is I think its main purpose is to make my Magic Online Commander decks illegal. This is a card that it looks like a colorless card. It's a colorless land, so it seems like you should be able to play it in any Commander deck. However, as we've seen in the past with things like Elbrus the Binding Blade, which is Whittaker Unbound on the backside, Westville Abbey, which is Ormondal on the backside, technically these count as black cards by the Commander color identity rule, which honestly is a rule I kind of dislike. I feel like, and let me know what you think in the comments, maybe I'm wrong and I'm super off base, my feeling is these should be counted as colorless cards. Like, sure, the backside is black, but you can't play it on the backside. That's not actually possible. You can only play the front side of the card. So I've always felt like these should be available to go in any Commander deck, and that the way color identity works with these transform cards in specific is a little bit wonky. So keep that in mind. If you're going to put this in a Commander deck, you got to have black in your color identity, or your deck is not technically going to be legal. Same as Elbrus, same as Westville Abbey. It's a mistake I make a ton building Commander decks. So anyway, that's Hostel Hotel. I think the card's sweet. I love the flavor of it. The backside is a relatively powerful creature. Only downside is that sorcery speed activation. That's the one thing that makes me a little skeptical, but if you're willing to build around it a bit, I think it can still be a really powerful card with decay stuff in a sacrifice style deck and so forth. In the world of lower rarity cards and reprints, no reprints today, but there are a few sweet uncommons I want to cruise through really quick. I know it's been a long one. We've had a ton of cards to talk about today. So Loyal Gryff, 3-mana 2/2 flash flyer. When it enters the battlefield, you can bounce one of your own creatures to your hand. It's a May ability, so you don't have to. Reminds me a little bit of a worse Stonecloaker. Well, probably worse. The downside of Stonecloaker is you have to bounce something, so if you don't have another creature, you can't just run it out. But Stonecloaker, kind of a cool synergy piece where you can flash it in, save a creature from removal, pick up a Mold Rifter that you recast, or a Cloud Blazer, something else with an ETB trigger. So Loyal Gryff, I don't think it's a busted card by any means, but it is a good enough uncommon to keep in mind, especially if you have ETB triggers that you can reuse with it. We also got Hungry for More. So red and a black for a sorcery. You get a 3/1 black and red vampire creature token with trample, lifelink, and haste. Sack it at the beginning of the next end step, and you can flash it back for 3 mana. So Hungry for More is a new take on Hellspark Elemental. Hellspark Elemental, basically exactly the same card, except it's mono red and you can unearth it for 2 rather than flash it back for 3. So Hungry for More, a tiny bit more expensive. Otherwise, you get the upside of lifelink on the token, which is nice. Is Hellspark Elemental good anymore? In the old days, Hellspark Elemental was a legit threat that you could play in like a burn deck, an aggro style deck. I'm not sure we're there anymore. I don't know if a 3/1 hasty trampling lifelinking token that goes away at the end of your turn, I don't know if that's something that's even playable, even with flashback. So we might have moved past that, but the comparison to a card that used to be good enough to see constructed play, and arguably in some ways an upgrade thanks to the lifelink, makes Hungry for More worth mentioning at least. We also got Sunset Celebration. This one I'm pretty sure is going to be good enough for Modern. 2-mana sorcery. If an opponent has more life than you, you gain 4 life. If an opponent controls more creatures than you, you create 2/1/1 white human tokens. If an opponent has more cards in hand hand in you, you get to draw a card. I'm hyped for this card because I think that it's an upgrade on Timely Reinforcements. Timely, kind of the same idea. If your opponent has more life than you, you gain 6 life. If they have more creatures, you get 3 1/1 tokens. So Sunset Celebration, kind of a mini version of Timely Reinforcements. 2 less life, 1 less token. The big deal is it's 1 less mana. And in a format like Modern or Legacy, where efficiency is key, the difference between 2 mana and 3 mana is absolutely massive. The card draw is another upside, although normally with Timely Reinforcements, it's played in control decks against aggro decks, and things have went horribly wrong if your control deck has less cards in hand than your opponent's aggro deck, so I don't think you're going to draw a card with this often. However, I think the fact that it's only 2 mana might mean that decks that are using Timely Reinforcements in Modern, Snapcaster decks primarily, might be willing to switch to Sunset Celebration, even though you get a little bit less out of it as far as life gain and tokens, just because the ability to cast it cheaper and flash it back with Snapcaster cheaper is really huge. So worth keeping in mind for older formats. Also, card draw in white. So who knows? Maybe they fix it. They broke it. They finally fixed white's problems in Commander. We also got Ritual of Hope, a pretty aggressive instant. 2 mana instant. Creatures you control get +1/+1 until end of turn. Coven, if you control 3 or more creatures with different powers, creatures you control instead get +2/+1 until end of turn. Worth mentioning because this kind of reminds me of Pride of Conquerors, and Pride of Conquerors was a legit played card in Standard not that long ago, giving all of your things +2 power at instant speed for 2 mana is a scary effect in an aggro deck. Not sure your aggro deck though can hit Coven consistently enough. You're gonna need what, a 1, 2, and 3 powered creature most likely. How easy is that gonna be to pull off? If this is only giving +1/+1, not worth it for Constructed, but if it's giving +2/+1, it could be in the conversation for some sort of token, aggro, go wide mono white style deck. So worth keeping in mind just in case. Otherwise, we got Brief Respite, 3 mana, enters the battlefield, exile non-land permanent opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. This is literally Banishing Light. Banishing Light makes another return with a different name. I'm pretty sure the primary purpose of this one is to work us slowly towards having an entire page of Banishing Lights with different names in our Magic Arena collection that we have to scroll through every time we are building a deck. There's literally no difference. I don't know why they print it with a different name. I guess flavor purposes, maybe, even though I'm imagining Banishing Light could work. I guess I gotta get those uncommon Wildwood cards somehow, and having everyone just use their Banishing Lights in Standard probably drive Wizards out of business with the lack of uncommon wild cards they'd be draining. So an okay card. Banishing Light not as good as it used to be because there's so many ways to kill it, but still close enough to being playable to mention it. We also got Necrosynthesis, which is kind of an interesting enchantment. 3 mana, black aura, enchant a creature. Enchant a creature has when another creature dies, put a +1/+1 counter on it, and then when enchant a creature dies, look at the top X cards of your library where X is its power, put one of those cards in your hand, the rest on the bottom. So Necrosynthesis, I want to mention for one reason, which is we've seen Sedgemoor Witch, Eye Twitch, Pest token combo decks be kind of a fringe thing in Standard, and I feel like this could be a good piece to that like sacrifice synergy aristocrat combo shell, where you slam this on your Eye Twitch or whatever, you sack a bunch of Pest tokens to Plumb the Forbidden, then you sacrifice the Eye Twitch. The Eye Twitch is going to get really big, you're going to be able to learn a lesson from your sideboard with your Eye Twitch, plus you're going to pseudo tutor by digging a bunch of cards deep in your deck to find another Plumb the Forbidden or whatever, to do it again and repeat the process. So I don't think you just play this generically, that's not going to be good enough, but in sacrifice combo style decks, I feel like this could actually be a reasonable support piece. Finally today, in Draft Chaff land, some interesting stuff for limited, a few more lower rarity MDFCs. Ambitious Farmhand, not that far from being playable. 2 mana 1/1, enters the battlefield, put a basic plains into your hand from your library, and then you can transform it for 3 mana if you have Coven into a 3/3 lifelink. So maybe that could do something, fixing your mana, or at least making sure you hit your land drops is a nice little upside there. And anyway, that brings us to the end of our daily Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers for today. So what do you think? This was a big one. We had so many cards to talk about. The new mythics, the Sackland, all that stuff. Let me know what you think in the comments. Of course, until we're back tomorrow, if you want to keep up on the latest spoilers, make sure to head over to mtgpreviews.com. Thanks so much for watching. I hope y'all enjoyed it, and I'll be back tomorrow with more daily Innistrad Midnight Hunt spoilers. So until then, have an amazing day, everyone. and I will talk to you soon.
Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.